Hello and welcome to EarthSkyLab meets Nooma Studio, a monthly discussion hosted by Victor Vorsky and Ramsey Yasser on topics of the social, spatial and temporal. The purpose of the show is to reach an audience of like-minded individuals and develop a discourse around our own personal practices. I'm a spatial practitioner and an architect by training from London. In 2019, I set up Nooma Studio, a design studio concerned with turning disuse space to public advantage. As part of our practice at Nooma Studio, we address temporal, spatial and social issues of the city. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our co-host this evening, Victor Vorsky, who's going to tell us a little bit about EarthSkyLab and introduce us to our guests.
Thank you, Ramsey. I'm Victor Vorsky. I'm a world citizen. My background is in product and project management. And my big interest in life is building a better future of humanity, seeing how I can contribute and how I can collaborate with others that are working to build a brighter future for all of us. For the past 6 years, my life work, my key project that I've been working on is EarthSkyLab, which is a project to build the next generation of human habitat, to build 21st century villages and neighborhoods, to build an environment which supports community and supports our connection with nature. And my partner on this project actually has been Evgenia Emets, who's our guest today. Evgenia is an artist and her big project right now is Eternal Forest. So Evgenia, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on this wonderful podcast. I'm really excited about what you both would like to create together about this new collaboration. And I'm really happy to be the first guest on this podcast. So I'm an artist, I'm a poet. I have been working in art since many years, and I've been writing poetry since I'm 14. My exploratory work is concerned with time, with notions of time and our perception of time. And I work across different medium, anything from calligraphic practice, which engages visual poetry. I work with sound poetry and with voice. I work with performance and installation. And recently, since we've been living in Portugal since more or less 2.5 years, I've also started weaving ecological thread into my art practice, hence the Eternal Forest project, about which we'll talk more today.
Great, thank you. So our topic today is tree time. So it is this idea of thinking about a time scale. As we all know, the universe is a few billion years old, as is the Earth, and the continents work on the scales of tens and hundreds of millions. And tree time is this idea of looking at time scales which are relevant to forests and ecosystems. So hundreds and thousands, tens of thousands of years. Since Evgenia is working on a project related to the forest, would love to hear you tell us how you see tree time and why it's relevant and what it is.
Thank you. Well, first of all, tree time is not really kind of a term. I guess we collectively came up with a term and we got excited about how it sounds. It sounds really beautiful. I think it sounds poetic, but also it actually starts meaning a lot to us. And I think we're going to try to unpack this today. So what is tree time for me? Why are we even starting to think about it? Why it's important to think about it? I guess that we are living in time on this planet where when we have to stop and think how we perceive the time of our life, but also the time that we are connected to by through our existence, through our continuity from generation to generation. And why it's important is because we've been conditioned for quite a long time now by this short-term thinking, and there are reasons for that. So I feel it's necessary at the moment to extend, first of all, to extend our thinking towards longer term and long periods of time, not just because it's nice to think about deeper time, but also because it actually, I believe that it actually directly affects how we do everything, how we create environments where we live, how we create spaces, how we create artworks, how we collaborate with each other. It affects literally every part of our life. So that idea of tree time is something that lies between really deep time and quite short span of human lifetime compared to deeper spectrum of time. So it's something that is perhaps easy for us to grasp, because tree time is anything on the scale of 100 years, but it actually goes beyond. It goes towards thousands of years, but it's still for us more or less easy to imagine.
Thank you, Evgenia. This is a really fascinating topic. And, you know, it does make me wonder, are humans supposed to be able to think of time beyond the day-to-day? I mean, I guess one question would be related to the fact that as humanity, we've only been around for 40,000 odd years as Homo sapiens. So to some extent, we are as a species very young on the planet, right? And we don't have this kind of lineage that takes us back to the same time scale as ecological systems or what have you. What do you think about that?
It's a really interesting question, because on one hand, I agree, of course, the existence of humans, it's relatively short compared to the life of this planet. However, I feel that since ancient times, we have been thinking in long periods of time, and we find proof of that everywhere, because ancient people have been creating spaces and monuments and kind of observatories that allowed them to observe the skies and observe the cycles and try to understand what are these, try to make sense of life. But I guess that appearance of these observation methods allowed people to actually imagine the different time scales. Perhaps they were not thinking exactly in these terms. They were approaching it from a different perspective. But I feel that we are constantly embedded into seeing around ourselves different time cycles, whether they're visible or invisible, whether they're kind of something that like a shorter time cycles that are embedded into longer ones. For example, when we're observing forest, we can very easily see short cycles of nature, literally things appearing, disappearing in the time of one day, or like a week or a month. But then there are much bigger cycles there in which those smaller cycles are embedded. So this kind of nested cycles, they're always there, and I'm pretty sure that humans have been aware about it, or gradually become aware about it. Plus, if we actually rewind history, there have been, I believe, as far as I understand, there have been more monuments and more traces in various civilizations, more monuments constructed, for example, towards this longer term thinking. I think it's just recent, I don't know how many 100 years, when we gradually went away from that kind of thinking and just are creating structures and are creating culture that is more directed towards, you know, short-term planning and short-term thinking.
So if I may be allowed to speak to the question, I think you are definitely right to a good degree, Ramsey. We haven't, you know, humans think in the span of a lifetime, or maybe a few lifetimes. You know, we say that some native cultures look at what seven generations forward, which is still not quite tree time. It's kind of a couple of 100 years. But I think that as we look at the world around us, it is clear that now humans impact all of the earth. Our activity, even, you know, the deepest reaches of Arctic and Antarctic, through the air, dust particles, etc., which are created and impacted by our activities, we impact all of the earth. So I think as part of our evolution and our growth as a species, it is clear to me that we are now moving from being just kind of consumers in the bountiful market of the Earth biosphere to being stewards. And we really need to become aware of how our activities impact the biosphere and ecosystems. So, and the biosphere and the ecosystem works at tree time and even longer time scales. So I think, yes, until now, we've had the luxury of not having to think at those kinds of time scales. But now, since we are becoming, our impact due to the power of our technologies, our impact is throughout the whole biosphere. So we are moving to being, you know, we have to, if we are to survive, we have to move to being conscious stewards of the ecosystems and the biosphere. So we have to think of what our impact will be at these much longer timescales. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally concur with that, Victor. I think it's a very fair point. So let's discuss your project, Evgenia, of Eternal Forest, and how the Eternal Forest is interested with the idea of tree time and how that's weaved into the very foundations of the project.
Yeah, so Eternal Forest project emerged. It's an art project, first of all, but it's also a multidisciplinary project in the end. It emerged from seeing a lot of, well, from receiving a lot of information and from seeing all around me the ecosystems being exhausted and forests disappearing very quickly, biodiversity disappearing. Viscerally speaking, why I started doing this project is where we live in Portugal, the ecological situation is pretty bad, is pretty difficult, largely due to monocultures, various monocultures, but mainly monocultures of eucalyptus plantations. But it's not just happening here, it's happening all over the world. Europe has been hugely deforested already for 500 years ago. So when I think about what is Eternal Forest Project, basically for me, this project is first of all calling to people to really start thinking about why do we need biodiverse natural forests, but also what is our relationship with the forest, what is our relationship with the wild natural spaces. So the project has been in development for the last 2 years, and it started off as a small research kind of looking at how communities live in the countryside, how communities live next to those monocultures. And I made a film, a series of artworks. I've been showing the film all around Portugal, but also abroad. But gradually I grew to feel that I would like to take these works elsewhere and think how we could create perhaps spaces where those spaces would be fit for a deeper connection with nature and for initiation by nature itself. So at the moment, Eternal Forest holds that vision to create 1,000 Eternal Forest sanctuaries all around Europe for now, to be protected over 1,000 years. So this sanctuary, the idea of the sanctuary is this space which is designed. It's a space that supports an artistic intervention, that is designed space. It supports biodiversity, and it supports a human experience in nature and with nature. And every sanctuary has a circle of guardians. It has a community that participates in its creation and development, but also participates through experiences, through ceremonies that are connected actually to cycles of nature. So this is the core of the project, and then the artistic expression of that idea is in the form of poetry manifesto currently, which is being read, recited together with audience at every Eternal Forest initiation, but also at every Eternal Forest experience. And in relation to our subject that we are discussing today, the project questions how can we create culture that looks beyond one human lifetime? How can we create culture that through generations would allow us to take care of those spaces, and that would allow us to create a continuity into the centuries, basically. So on one hand, to create beautiful biodiverse ecosystems and forests. On the other hand, to create supportive structure where humans can actually go to these places and experience them in a deeper way.
Fascinating.
Right.
So, Victor, did you have
Yes.
something?
So I wanted to ask, why 1,000-year timeline, and why is it important to be 1,000? Why not 100 or 10,000 or?
In the timeline of the project on one hand is symbolic, of course. It could be 100 years, could be 10,000. However, if we look at the actual figure, at the actual timeline of 1,000 years, what it means is that if we look at the forest ecosystem, at the stable forest ecosystem, 1,000 years is really when a forest is given chance to become a stable, functional ecosystem. 100 years is just not enough for a forest to be something that we call a real forest. So 100 years is usually when forest is on its way to emergence. There's still a lot of processes happening where they could be stricken by diseases and different kind of occurrences where the whole ecosystem can actually be wiped out. But then 1,000 years is already that period where we can see some stability in that system. But on the other hand is also kind of a dream that invites people to step out of a normal time scale and to really try to imagine what it means for us to create something that is really long-term. We're never going to see that. We're never going to experience that, but we can try collectively to imagine, to really open our minds to that kind of vision. But also, 1,000 years is not such a huge time scale, because we have a lot of examples of young forests which were created by humans that exist on the timeline on the shorter period of time, 70 to 100, 300 years and so on. and they are already really beautiful, lush spaces where we go and we really enjoy from all the different perspectives. There is water, there is beautiful fresh air. Aesthetically speaking, there is a lot for us to see because we are very much wired in terms of aesthetics and what we see around and different stratas. So if we break it down, we can already put on this timeline some real examples of the forests that exist. For example, here around where we are, there are two forests. Monsanto, which is around 70, 80 years old. Park of Sintra is just over 200 years old. And these are just two examples. There are many more.
Cool. Fascinating. I mean, I think it's really beautiful to hear an artist start working with these kind of much more ambitious timelines, especially when so much art in our modern world is joined the consumer's disposable fray and is designed to be either completely ephemeral or not really designed with thought for the long term. So it's really fascinating. I think it will propose a lot of challenges, but I really think, to me, it feels like actually this Eternal Forest project, it's a new direction for art in general, right? Ramsey?
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting point, but I wonder actually if there is if this is really a solution to an alternative worldview to the capitalist model that we have at the moment. Often I think that is the crux of the capitalist view, is that it's not supposed to be a long-term view. It's a cyclical system that is supposed to be working on an increasingly shorter time scale, because that aids consumerism and production, right? And I think when we start to question this idea of the human perception of time, actually we might start to propose a whole new culture, a whole new way of doing things. And that for me is incredibly exciting. And I wonder actually how can we take this out of the realms of art? How does this start to seep into the actual mass psyche, as opposed to an art audience?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I may try to answer this question. So first of all, Eternal Forest Sanctuaries, that vision, although it is an art project, I call it an art project because the approach is artistic. First of all, the project itself is multidisciplinary, so you cannot create an Eternal Forest Sanctuary without the skills and the involvement of many people. There must be a collaboration taking place between an artist, a landscape designer, ecosystem restoration specialists, biodiversity experts, forestry and forest engineers, and of course community more than anything. And so far I've done some work with local communities, and I can see that people are incredibly interested and incredibly open. And this is not your usual art crowd that goes to all the big biennales and galleries and museums. These are really people who, they see art once in a while, but for them, they're excited. Of course, I think a lot about how to make this, the process of creating those spaces, of emerging those spaces, but also the process of participating in Eternal Forest experience, how to make it accessible for everybody, not just the art audience. And I think there is something there for everyone to step into, because when we talk about discovering our inherent connection with nature, we are part of nature. It's not just rediscovering that connection, we're rediscovering what we are, basically, because we are part of nature, full stop. So I feel it's for everyone already by default. And then because we are talking about engaging the whole community, it's intergenerational, and it has to be passed on and on and on through oral stories, through ceremonies, through cyclical celebrations, through building or creating a movement where this knowledge and information spreads in many different ways. And of course, more than anything, I'm not thinking of building those 1,000 sanctuaries myself, which means that there will be always other people coming into the project, other artists, other landscape designers, other people who are interested in reforestation, who are interested in enhancing biodiversity where they live, who are interested in having something very special next to their village, next to their community. We are very much looking at a model where a local community, each local community can have its own sanctuary, which means that, these are the people who live everywhere, not just around big cities where you have kind of congregation of culture and concentration of art. This is why I feel that this project has potential to really embrace and offer a lot to many different kinds of people.
Yeah, if I may add a few things, I think at least for in some periods of time, it was seen as the role of art to actually explore new ideas and to bring new forms of thinking. Certainly we can think of in the 20th century artists that explored, for example, gender norms and ideas around gender, and pushed society through their work into new, more open, different ways of thinking. So I think certainly over the last 100, 200 years, it has been seen as one of the roles of art to change people's thinking. And as to the whole capitalism question, I mean, yes, what is capitalism? It's a whole separate talk, but I think it's clear that a large part of the economy has now moved towards services. So maybe it's time where we can actually move good parts of the land out of the productive, capitalist, extractive mode into something like this, where it's art, it's community, it's environment, right? We see all of these efforts around to grow forests, though actually a lot of them is actually, I think, it's going to be production forests, so it's actually tree pulp factories. But I think it's time, and certainly in Europe, all of the countries, we're wealthy enough that we have this, and we have the space, the countryside is being depopulated. We have this space, and we know that we need parts of the land to be well out of the productive consumerist capitalist mode and to be used in a different way.
Some very interesting points there. So I'd like to move the conversation a little bit into the idea of the eternal forest as being a way of preserving the forest, preserving part of our natural habitat on the planet. And how do we reconcile this with the growth of human population and the increase in development? If we take London as an example, what we have here is a green belt, right? So in order to address the issues of urban sprawl, we have something like a policy in place that creates almost a sanctuary of the green belt, right? You can't develop into it. So this city that's growing at a rapid pace is kind of growing into itself. I think this question goes to both of you, really. How do you feel about this in 1,000 years, if populations continue to grow the way they do? I would have thought that we would require additional deforestation in order to make space for housing, in order to make space for agricultural land. So, you know, what solutions do you see to this?
So if I may be allowed, is it okay if I speak to that?
Yes, of course.
So if you look at all of the projections have a bump and then the human population goes down. So the whether the bump is going to be 20, 50, 80 or 100 years from now, it varies from projection to projection, but pretty much all the projections show that population will eventually start shrinking. Certainly it's clear we can't pave over all of the earth, right? I mean, we need nature and the biosystem, the ecological systems to provide clean air and to provide the environment that we live in. So we definitely need the forests. Also, through the intensification of production, and now if you look at, you know, indoor production, hydroponics, and, you know, vat-grown protein and such things, I think we will intensify the production of food that way. It'll become much more factory wise. Like, for example, now a lot of land is used for animals for meat production. I personally think that by the time I die, you're going to eat meat about as often as you eat boar or bear, right? I mean, you can go out and get a boar steak somewhere, but it's not something normal. I think cow is going to become the same way. The normal animal-like protein is going to be vat grown. It's just clear. And that will free up a lot of land, which we have to. We need forests. Also, from what I understand, the idea of eternal forest, it's sanctuaries, it's pockets of biodiversity. And the great thing is there's been actually a lot of research that's shown that a small pocket of biodiversity has a great positive impact on a much larger area around it. So having this pocket of biodiversity has a great positive impact on a lot of farmland around it. Evgenia, do you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. So, just to the question of expansion and we need more land for production, I wanted to add that right now there is also huge movement towards biological organic farming and local kind of initiatives, which are supposed to provide for the people very locally. And I'm hoping that that movement would grow, which means that if we're looking at organic production, nobody would want to have, you know, pesticides going into the land, because actually everybody would want, you know, people would want local bees, and kind of you need to keep that ecosystem really healthy. So in a way, purely from ecological perspective, eternal forest sanctuaries, I see them in a way like time capsules, but also capsules of rich biodiversity where we, of course, nature is allowed to be. We are not taking anything from sanctuaries. Apart from, you know, we go there to have our experiences and human experiences in human ceremonies. And that's all great, but we also have to think, if we turn the whole thing around and step away from anthropocentric perspective, what do we need? I think I have a feeling that a lot of people in the world start really waking up and asking the question, what does the earth need? What do other creatures need? We're talking about the rights given to rivers and streams and mountains and forests and so on. So people are waking up to that idea that they're not anymore, you know, the ones controlling everything. We need Earth to be able to have life. Earth can survive without us, but we cannot survive without healthy Earth. So there is it's another dimension, it's another story, it's another conversation, I guess. But the way I see it, one of the roles of those eternal forest sanctuaries, apart from creating the basis for continuous culture, quite different culture from the one that we're experiencing right now, long-term culture, they are also those time capsules for life itself, for things that might not be preserved or might not be encouraged outside of the sanctuaries, which means that according to the idea of ecotone, there is the borderline between one and the other ecosystem. One ecosystem can really affect the other in terms of seed preservation, the bee pollination, and there is a crossover. So the idea, the sanctuaries can be anything from 1 hectare to 10 hectares, for example, depending on where they are and on what kind of land they embedded within. So if we're saying it's a 10 hectare sanctuary, for example, within a 3 hectare larger land, larger ownership, or larger community land, or I don't know, larger productive land even, that means that that place is the sanctuary for biodiversity, full stop. And things can evolve. Also, we can observe and we can learn from that place, because we let nature be, we let nature do its own thing, we let nature teach us what is meant to happen and what can be done together with nature, in collaboration with nature, in the rest of the space that's near it, in that local climate and local ecosystem.
Cool. I think I think there is certainly, we clearly understand that there's many benefits to biodiversity and to special protected areas. This idea of sanctuaries or parks or nature preserves has been around for over 100 years, and it's growing, and this is something that Europe has been famous worldwide, and this is something we're fortunate with. But I think this idea of protecting something for 1,000 years is something I'd like us to talk about now, because as you said, Ramzi, this is really thinking at these timescales is a new idea. Maybe aside from the megalomaniac grandeur of the pyramids, which were built at the costs of the misery of thousands or hundreds of thousands. Aside from that, we haven't really done anything at this kind of a time scale.
It's connected to death and eternal life, the idea of death and eternal life most of all. However, recently there are some examples of art pieces or art projects which actually think about long-term thinking, which encourage long-term thinking. For example, there is a piece by Jem Finer, Long Player. So it's a piece of, I would say, music composition, sound composition that's supposed to play long-term, as long as there is a computer running the program, I guess. So I think it's already been playing for how long? 10 years? Longer? No, longer, much longer. I think 20 years
20
at least.
or 30. I think it started in the 90s.
Yeah. So, and it's in London. It's Trinity Buoy Wharf, and it's connected with basically sampling Tibetan bowls and, playing this kind of eternal composition again and again and again. And I think it also never repeats, so it repeats with cycles of time. So I think this piece is actually connected more with the idea of eternal return, with the cyclical time, with the cycles, and making us think what the cycles are. Then, of course, we know about the Long Now Foundation that have quite a few different projects. They also do some activities in the arts. I think they support some activities in the arts, but they are also building the 10,000-year clock. I think it's still being built. So I think there are some examples out there. Of course, in the majority of in essence, our culture, I think, because it is going through major crisis, part of this crisis, I think short-term thinking is not the root of the crisis, but I think it's the it's on the surface. It's kind of the superficie of this kind of disease that we all experiencing as society. So from that perspective, we maybe are struggling to find examples. There is a lot of, I think, in the arts, there are quite a few conceptual projects, but I think I'm interested much more in something that's much more tangible and that has potential to really shift culture, because culture is something that takes longer than anything else to change.
Yes, and
it takes time. It takes time, and it takes also critical mass to shift certain tendencies and certain patterns in culture. And I wanted to also respond in terms of.
I want to challenge that, because culture is funny, right? We have fashions in clothing and in music which change, season by season. So some parts of culture
Which
actually,
reflects a short-term thinking, exactly.
yeah, and like there used to be 3 seasons in fashion. Now some of the fashion retailers every month or even more
Yeah.
frequently change their product line. So some parts of culture, at least, are super quickly changing.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to just say one note on that idea of eternal time. It's not just the imagining something that's really long. It's about, for me, is I would say the geometry of time is how we perceive what actually happens with time and how we break it down and how we relate to it in terms of creating things and building things or co-creating things. So there is difference between the arrow of time, which has unidirectional arrow, and the cycles of time. And as far as I feel, there is need to really look much more at the cycles in nature, because nature can teach us a lot about how the cycles are working, how they're intersecting, how they're embedded into each other. And there is a huge complexity there, which I think we have been kind of largely ignoring for a reason, because we chose to look at nature as kind of a mechanism and how to break things down and make things understandable and easy for us. And so we created our society on the basis of this kind of mechanistic idea of time. So in a way, yeah, we kind of, it's kind of eternity, but it's not that kind of eternity. It's this linear as opposed to cyclical and complex.
And to that, I just found the example that escaped me a little earlier on, which was, we have gene banks, for example, right? So you've got Svalbard in Norway, which is a gene bank which is built to last 1,000 years. And it's a secure seed bank set up to hold seeds of species from around the
Seeds of different plants. Yes, it actually got
different
flooded
plants.
recently, so their 1,000-year building, or at least one of the seed banks, got flooded, so their 1,000-year building clashed with climate change and didn't quite
Right.
work out. But I would still propose to you that yes, of course, such projects exist. You could probably still count all of them on the fingers of two hands, most likely, and they're the exceptions rather than the rule of everything else that we build.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to to very much our prominent culture. Our prominent economic and social system is one that is based on consumption and immediacy. So it's essentially, it needs to run on a much shorter time scale. Businesses are often assessed on an annual scale, right? So it's a financial year,
Quarterly,
or even which is then
many
broken down
companies
into
report
quarterly.
quarterly.
Absolutely. So that is the system we're in. And when you're talking about our prominent economic system being assessed in such a way, it becomes very difficult to make the economic argument for you to view projects in any other way.
Yeah, this is why I think Evgenia doing this project from the point of view of art is worthwhile and makes sense, because yes, like you say, trying to do anything in the standard business world with timescales past years or decades is impossible. People would laugh at you. but within other realms, whether art, culture, or the sacred, those are timescales which are allowable and permissible. So for me, as I've been thinking about this, I look around, since like I said before, I believe humans are in control now. We're in the driver's seat. We're a little bit like a monkey that's kind of got in front of the thing, but now we've got to learn how to drive very, very, very quickly, because the car is moving quickly, and just randomly jerking on the steering wheel in other levels is going to result in a crash. So I've been thinking and looking at, what are the human systems which have lasted at these kinds of timescales, and there's very few businesses which have been. Actually, I read an article once in The Economist about the oldest businesses, and there's some 400, 600-year-old hotels in Switzerland and Japan, where you would expect, but they're small businesses. But the big organizations which I see, which have lasted these kinds of timescales, are the religious institutions. The Catholic Church is somewhere around 2,000, 1,800 years old. Other religions are similarly old. Is it still the same? Is it still the same church that it was 2,000 years ago? That's a different argument, but there is certainly a continuity, and we certainly believe it's a continuous institution that's been running that long. And I think that this is going to be what will be needed for this Eternal Forest project to actually last and to protect this area for 1,000 years. It's not about designing the landscape or anything like that. It's designing the human systems around it that are going to protect this little pocket of forest of biodiversity for the long term from other humans that are going to try and come in and cut it and whatever.
I think that's a super interesting point you just made there, Victor, because I did want to ask, how do we do this? How do we make a 1,000-year-long project, or to be more specific to our discussion today, how do we make a 1,000-year-long sanctuary? And I think you've just suggested that we need to make a religion. Has this ever crossed your minds? Or
Well, I mean, in jokingly, but I do not want to imply that, since I know that would be controversial and sacrilegious. I'm just saying that it is a fact that the oldest institutions that are still viable, running, and vibrant are the religious ones. I'm not implying that it's required to build a religion, but I am saying that these institutions have survived, so there is a lot to learn from them.
I mean, in a sense, religion is a project in itself that as an example we could have used earlier, as a project in itself that attempts to have some level of long-term thinking on time, right? So religion attempts to transcend time, and it's kind of written into itself. So perhaps there are some clues there about how we go ahead and create this culture of the eternal forest that lasts so long.
Yes, certainly the religious project is a search for universals, right? For things which are valid above and beyond time, whether Ten Commandments or other religious prescriptions. It is the goal and the search for the universal.
So I would like to quickly respond on that, just briefly. When I was working on developing the Eternal Forest Sanctuary vision last summer, one of the first texts that appeared even before manifesto was written is the text that basically is a very short text. There's a couple of pages, and it's about the idea of sacred time and sacred space. And I kind of tried to imagine in a very metaphorical way, in a very compact way, how we as culture, as kind of long-term stretch of civilization, not the different civilizations that existed, but as humanity, how have we managed to come out of that continuity where everything was sacred, and the time was sacred, and the space was sacred, and we did not separate ourselves. We didn't say nature is there and we are here. And how have we managed gradually to arrive to this point where we now, where we have to protect nature, we have to put literally sometimes fences around it to be able to go and enjoy it, and to be able to let it be and let it survive and let it continue and have all this biodiversity and animals, etc. And so in somewhere in between, this partitioning, that separation and putting separately, you know, there is this sacred time and sacred space which gradually was taken out. The continuity was broken somehow. And I keep thinking about it. I think it's a super fascinating subject. And then we suddenly started building temples, which were temples with walls and, you know, and roofs. And we would go to the temple and we would do our ceremonies, that we would pray inside a temple. Before that, it was the forest, it was natural spaces. So I think we have that memory, and I think we have all the clues and all the keys that we need to be able to reopen those doors that maybe are not even so tightly locked. And this is why my invitation through Eternal Forest Sanctuaries, first of all, it would be to invite people to that space, to be initiated by nature itself, which requires patience and it requires time. So this is why I envision that those experiences in nature, they can be lasting hours, sometimes a couple of days, and sometimes it could be a week. And if somebody chooses, there could be longer periods of time, because that is literally what is required for us to step back into that space and time and to be able to experience it. So we understand, not with our intellect only, not only with our kind of brain, but also with our all of our being, what it is and what it means. So, and the word religion, we know that the origin of this word is religar, is to reconnect. So that's how this word emerged. It's now used to identify world religions and religious movements, but in fact, this word comes from any kind of reconnection. So reconnection with the spirit, with the divine, with all that is, with the universe. So this is my, and yeah, I think thinking about the idea of what is sacred time and what is sacred space goes back to thinking about long-term and kind of beyond this kind of time scales that is beyond just one human lifetime.
I think that's a really really interesting thing you just said there, Evgenia, and that there is this kind of very interesting aspect of the body and the spirit within places that are significant to us, and you know, the idea that places are actually what become those culturally significant places, or those spiritually significant places, and they have a persistence over time, right? So it's very normal for a place that was once a spiritually significant place to in a pagan sense, or to a pagan culture, actually then becomes a palimpsest, which is then built over by a new culture or a new religion. And those holy spaces, or those spiritual spaces, actually have that persistence over time, regardless of the change in human culture, right? So, or the change in human politics.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of persistence is very interesting, and I wonder, really, you know, is this the power of the Eternal Forest Sanctuary, and that it's creating these nodes on the planet, right? These really important significant places on the planet that will have that persistence. And maybe, you know, today it's a clearing in amongst some trees, and maybe in 200 years it's a cabin in the woods, and maybe in 500 years it's a temple, right? You know, is the sanctuary still preserved? If there's no longer a forest around it, is the sanctuary still preserved?
Well, I believe that the forest has memory and the land has memory of what was there before. So I had several experiences where we would go to a place, I would go to a place and I would connect with that place, and I would decide that this is the place that I would want to create some kind of experience for the people, and I would invite people, and then people themselves would tell me, do you realize that that place is an ancient place of divination in nature? So I had a couple of those experiences. So I think we know, when we go to such places, we already know when we step in. And I'm very curious, how can we, by creating those places in nature, how can we do it in such a way that just by stepping in, we already know? We don't even need to be explained anything in verbal form, perhaps. We don't need like to read this long kind of descriptions that's usually you have to do in art when you go to art galleries and see conceptual art that has a long text attached to it. Oral culture is important, storytelling is important, poetry and song and chanting is all beautiful and incredible. But I think the very first thing is when we go, we know it's a special place. We don't know why. Nature tells us. It kind of, it invites us. It somehow opens to us, sometimes in different ways. So you say that, you know, these places might not be preserved with the forest that we create today. In 500 years, the forest maybe will be destroyed. Of course, it will happen because there are cycles, and we as humans, we also have a bit of an issue of losing that cultural memory and not learning from our lessons. So, and it happens all the time in history. We have lots of examples when we kind of decide, well, we don't remember that lesson anymore, so we have to go and learn again, which is fine. But I believe that those places will remember. There will be something left there, on some kind of level, whether it's a stone that reminds people there was something there, or whether this energy, or whether the trees, the way they're planted in a circle, or how the stream runs through it, and how everything is arranged, or maybe it's just something that's left in the air. So I think the point is not that it's preserved over 1,000 years. The point is that we embody this process, we embody this work, and we are carrying the culture, and we are guardians of what do we want to be guardians of, what is our role, what is our mission here. So I think it is about really looking at this project from the perspective of what is the mission of human beings on planet Earth at the moment, and how can we really contribute, how can we be worthy of this absolutely fantastic planet that we are living on. How can we make this experience brilliant and thriving and beautiful, and elevate ourselves as spiritual beings together with these kind of activities?
Cool. So we've been talking for quite a while. I realized about halfway through that we kind of bit off a very big philosophical topic, kind of funny for our first recording. But just to bring it to something more practical, this idea of tree time, so thousands of years, the time scale at which trees, forests, and ecosystems live, how do you think us, normal humans who live in human time, how can we experience it? Evgenia, maybe, then Ramsey?
Well, first of all, I think, and this is what I personally am going to do this year, If we can, without flying too much, hopefully we should go to those places that are there waiting for us. There are plenty of places in Europe. There are still places in Europe, but there is such a place on every continent where you have a sanctuary, a natural sanctuary, where you have old growth forests, where you have something that you can personally connect with, and you can have like your own mini vision quest, and let nature tell you, let nature teach you how to be and what to do, and that some kind of a next step. So that is one practical thing. And another practical thing is just really be with your community and see if a community has a need and has capacity to start thinking about emerging something like Eternal Forest Sanctuary, something like that, and open that conversation within community. I believe this is the very necessary first step. A lot of communities have common land. In many different countries it's called in different ways, there are different laws, but this common land is one of the first steps that can be done to look at it and see what wants to emerge there.
Cool. Ramsey?
Well, I think the experience of tree time, it's everywhere, right? It's a question of opening people's eyes to it. It's a question of making people realize that, you know, the reason that your street is shaped the way it's shaped, or the reason that your city has a specific geolocation on the planet is actually because of time. It's because of something that some geological occurrence, some natural occurrence over time that has actually created a certain landform or created a river that runs through a piece of land. And actually we've come and we've produced space within the confines of that spatial order that was actually dictated, you know, potentially many thousands of years ago. We could even go back and, you know, some Earth formations can probably go back to the creation of the planet Earth. So it's really a matter of finding ways of creating an appreciation of how, you know, we are very much existing within a much wider context of time. So I think, in answer to your question, we experience tree time every day, in every way. We just need to be aware of it.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking the same thing. It's, of course, it's around us. Of course, it's happening, and it's about having the mindset. I think what Evgenia was suggesting, effectively plant a tree, because the second you plant a tree and you start thinking of, you know, you've invested into this little being, fairy little green being, and then you start thinking of, you know, who and how is it going to protect it for the next couple of hundred of years. I think as I think through my life, perhaps the one time where I had like the real biggest experience of really feeling tree time was some years ago when my grandfather, so it will be some decades ago when my grandfather was still alive. And he took me to the land where he grew up, which is in eastern Poland near the border of Ukraine. It used to be a rich estate. Where my great-grandfather, who of course passed away many decades before I was born, was the forester. He was responsible for the forest. And my grandfather took me to this overgrown pine, big trees. And he said, your great-grandfather planted this. And I just had this kind of like Zoom connection between the human and him working 100 years ago there to plant these trees and the trees being there. And I have to say it was, I mean, I was still fairly youngish, but it was in a way a profound and a strong experience. So I think the growing trees and planting trees, or forests, or forest sanctuaries, which will be there for a long term, I see it as giving the gift of the experience of big trees, of older trees, to future generations. Recently, I had a kind of similar experience when I was in Denmark, north of Copenhagen. There is an old hunting forest, which has many old trees, many hundreds of years old, massive. It would probably take 4 or 5 people holding out hands to go around the trunk. And just taking a moment and thinking what this tree has seen, everything it's lived through, all of the human dynasties, histories, countries that it's gone through. It's, yeah, allowing yourself to experience that mindset and creating experiences so you can be in tree time, whether it's planting a tree, planting a forest, or looking at an old one and thinking through in your mind, what has this tree gone through, what has it seen. I think it's very worthwhile, and also I think it's good for something we haven't talked about. It's also good for our mental health, because we live in times which are so uncertain, so tumultuous. Planting a tree and allowing yourself to stretch your mind to think of these very different timescales can actually be very grounding and stabilizing. And at least for me, it makes me feel calmer and more stable. So it's been a fun conversation. Thank you very much, Ramzi and Evgenia. We'll be continuing this Nooma Studio meets EarthSkyLab conversations. Maybe next time on some less weighty topic, something more practical. But I'm sure it'll be still very brainy, because this is the kind of people we are.